Well, hello out there to our international audience of liberty lovers and pro liberty thinkers. I'm Trevor Krause, and I work for the Learn Liberty YouTube channel associated with Students for Liberty. And today we have a fascinating discussion, another part of our New Frontiers of Objectivism series with Dr. Eric Daniels. And I'll bring him in just a minute and have him introduce himself further. I want to tell you briefly about some of the things that I do and what I'm working on. As I said, I write scripts for the Learn Liberty YouTube channel powered by Students for Liberty. And we also launched a new channel recently called The Invisible Lens. And our most recent video described analyzes the Barbie movie from a pro liberty and an economic perspective. Professor Deirdre McCloskey was our guest for that video. And Professor McCloskey will be at LibertyCon, which is our keystone event. It's been called the Super Bowl of libertarian events. That's going to be in Washington, D.C., the first weekend of February, February 2nd through 4th. Again, that's LibertyCon in Washington, D.C. Check it out at libertycon.com if you're interested in joining us. The week leading up to LibertyCon in Washington, D.C. is where we will host the Prometheus Fellowship program powered by the Prometheus Foundation. That's where I got this mug. It's one of my favorites at the meeting last year in Miami, and that program is available to the 50 or so top performers in the Students for Liberty network. These are the best of the best, and we highly encourage you to apply if you're out there. And if the ideas that we'll discuss today with Dr. Eric Daniels on objectivism, if those ideas appeal to you and inspire you to want to do further research and further thinking, then apply to the Prometheus Fellowship program. Again, we're allowing our international audience to filter in here before our discussion with Dr. Eric Daniels. Today's discussion will center on Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism and the morality of free markets and what capitalism has to do with freedom, with the prosperity that laissez-faire can bring, and whether capitalism is in fact the only morally defensible economic system. We've got some hellos from Tennessee, not too far from where I am, a hello from Berlin, which is very far from where I am. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, and our guest, Dr. Eric Daniels, is in South Carolina. Thank you for joining us from Brazil, I see, as well. Today's discussion is going to be really interesting. Again, to introduce myself, I'm Trevor Krause, story editor and scriptwriter for the Learn Liberty and Invisible Lens YouTube channel. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us on for our discussion today. And I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Eric Daniels to talk about the morality of free markets. Dr. Daniels is the assistant director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. He holds a bachelor's degree in history and rhetoric, which will come in handy today, from Drake University, and a PhD in American history from the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Daniels, thank you for joining us today. Tell our global audience just a little bit about yourself and what you're most passionate about.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Trevor. It's great to be here and really great to be talking to everybody around the world today about capitalism, which is such a vital topic. So just a little bit about myself. As you mentioned, my PhD is in American history, but in particular, I studied American and really more broadly Western intellectual history. And so now at Clemson University, I am the assistant director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, which is a unit within the university that exists to study the foundations of a free society. So the moral, the political, and sometimes even the economic foundations of capitalism. We're really, though, the only think tank oriented place in an American university that is not specifically focused on the economics of capitalism, of which there are many, but on the political and moral foundations of capitalism. Under that guise, we have a program called the Lyceum Program, which is an undergraduate scholarship program that exists to give a kind of great books oriented or education in these ideas about the foundations of a free society. So in that sequence, our scholars take classes in everything from ancient political thought, modern political thought, a course on the political theory of capitalism, constitutional law, a whole variety of courses throughout their time. And really what we do is we continue that conversation about the role of liberty and freedom in a flourishing society. So what I'm really passionate about, in particular, I have a particular interest in the law, constitutional law, and the legal foundations of a free society. I've written some on the history of monopolies and antitrust, on free speech. So my particular interest in capitalism from a personal perspective is on the legal institutions, but I also, as in my role as director here, we take a look at a whole variety of aspects of capitalism and the kind of institutions that support it. Oh, we're looking at a fix. I'm going to just vamp here for you. Yeah. Sounds like Trevor's working on a fix, but I'll just a little bit more about myself. I have in a number of articles in the Objective Standard, which I know the Students for Liberty, we'll probably get a link up there that you can check out on various topics. I'll be at the Prometheus Fellows event for the Students for Liberty in anticipation of LibertyCon. I'll be speaking to last year's fellows who are wrapping up and the new fellows coming on this year. It's a great program. It's really an excellent opportunity to meet people interested in liberty from around the world and have some really robust discussions about these ideas and really learn more not only about the ideas, but about how to effectively communicate them and put them into action. So I highly recommend that for anybody who wants to check it out. I think it's a year-long program where students do a number of events. And in addition to attending the LibertyCon, there are other events and trainings that are involved in that. So it's really a great opportunity. Well, Trevor's working on his technical issues. Unfortunately, I'm just going to go ahead and self-interview for a second here, so everybody can not just have dead air and my pretty face looking at them, but here's some ideas. And I'll just start off with, I think the most basic idea in our discussion today is, what does Ayn Rand mean when she says that capitalism is the only moral system? And I think to start that answer, the real basis of our discussion has to be, what are we even talking about when we're evaluating a political social system in an ethical and a moral way? And what Ayn Rand means by that is that she wants to go more radically than the typical discussion. Often discussions of different social systems, capitalism, socialism, various other mixed economies, turns on the question of the consequences. It's a utilitarian kind of argument. Which one produces more? Which one gets more? The historical record on that couldn't be more clear. But Ayn Rand says the discussion really should start by asking ourselves the question, what are the conditions? What are the social and political conditions under which human beings, as rational actors in the world, can actually act morally and ultimately attain flourishing, right? Ultimately attain the goals and values that they set for themselves. And her answer is that there are two preconditions that set the terms of any moral social system. And those preconditions are that that political system has to meet the preconditions that individuals, to act successfully, to attain their values, to apply their minds to the problem of survival, have to have freedom. They have to be free from the initiation of physical force. And in order to do that, in order to act morally in a society, that implies essentially a set of negative responsibilities to other people. As long as you are pursuing your values and engaging in productivity and trade without violating the rights of others, you are leaving them the room to act morally. In a social system like this, a system that recognizes and protects individual rights, which is the basis of capitalism, everyone has the opportunity to act in a moral way. And the society and the government that that society chooses should exist solely for the purpose of protecting those individual rights, not to redistribute resources, not to regulate the production of certain activities, but fundamentally as a guarantor of that negative responsibility of everyone to basically leave everyone else alone so that they can attempt to attain those values. Of course, it's not a guarantee. It's merely the precondition for moral action. Other social systems, Ayn Rand said, necessarily involve violating the individual rights of some members of society in order to attain those supposed collective goals of other members of society. So that's really the basis for this conversation, is to recognize the real shift that Ayn Rand is making in talking about how we find what it is that's a moral system.
Eric, you are fantastic and you are amazing while Trevor works through this technical issue that he's going through. Luckily, I'm the one that helped draft up these questions. I just didn't review them as well as he did. So
no worries.
So objectivism places a strong emphasis on individual rights. You already covered this, limited government intervention. So how do you address concerns that this approach might lead to a lot of the concerns people have, income inequality, or providing help for the most vulnerable members in society, people with pre-existing conditions, health insurance, all of those things? Are there mechanisms within capitalism that can help address these issues?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a terrific question. The income inequality one, which I know is a huge topic right now and a concern for many people, and it comes up a lot. And one of the questions is, how do you deal with the fact that in what we designate a capitalist system? And of course, one thing to note that's important, which Ayn Rand noted, is that as much as we might say that we have a capitalist inspired system, the United States, the other Western democracies have what is, in essence, a mixed economy. They have a mixture between a fully laissez-faire capitalist economy and political system and something that is more tending toward welfare state socialism, or what we call a mixed economy. That being said, one of the questions that often arises is, how do you deal with the fact that in these economies, it seems like there is ever increasing concentration of wealth at the very highest reaches of society, that certain people are allowed to make tons and tons of money and enrich themselves and continue to get rich, while people at the very bottom are being immiserated. Well, the first fact I think that we should focus on is we have to ask ourselves, is that actually true? Right? It's a common narrative, and it's something that people a lot of the time point out. But it's vitally important that we actually investigate: is this narrative actually true? And I think that the best research, some of the best research that's coming out of leading economists and recent books that have been published, sort of in the back and forth of this debate, have suggested that there's certain ways that you can measure this that make it look a lot more divisive than other ways. And it's a complicated narrative. Beyond that, though, I think the more important point is, what is the source of that inequality? Is the inequality, is the fact that I make twice as much as my neighbor, let's say, a result of our free choices and actions in a capitalist economy? Or is that inequality a result of the government determining that my profession, for example, is remunerated at a higher rate than other professions, say that of my neighbor? The most important question is the inequality that might develop an inequality of tastes and values and resources? So, for example, we can imagine that in a capitalist system, some people would prefer to trade off more leisure time for potentially higher income, where some people in that economy may trade off higher levels of income for leisure time. They work harder and longer hours because for them, the long-term planning that they might be able to achieve something with a high income level is more important than their current leisure time, where someone else might say, look, I'm happy only working this hard at the moment because I prefer to spend time with my children, let's say, or I prefer time, to spend time surfing or something like this. There's a whole kind of array of choices that people make within that capitalist system. But to go beyond that and to say, well, so that's fine. We might recognize that in the first question, inequality might not be as big as people think, and it might not function the way it does. One of the most interesting pieces of research that's come out recently, in the United States at least, is that the most dramatic statements or quotes about income inequality often don't take into account the higher tax rate that large income earners make or that they pay, and they don't take account of the transfer payments that are given from government through that tax money to the lower income levels. And then if you actually build in how much money is flowing to and from these individuals and don't just count paper income, the income inequality is less. It still exists, of course. And then we have to look at, where does it come from? Is it the free choice of individuals, or is it through interventions of the government in the marketplace? To the extent that it is the intervention of government by favoring certain market choices, the solution to this problem is to remove those false incentives, to remove those interventions from the marketplace, so that the government is letting people make those choices on their own, and letting the inequality that may develop be a result of individual choices uncoerced by the government. And then the last part of your question is, well, let's say that there are situations where individuals do in fact find themselves in need of assistance. What does a laissez-faire capitalist system do with that? And I think two things I would point out with that is, one is take a look at the historical record of benevolence under various kinds of economic and political systems. And then two, take account of the fact that the wealth that's created by capitalism is a wealth that raises as they say, it's the rising tide that raises all boats. In a capitalist economy, the general standard of living is unparalleled, right? I mean, the famous hockey stick that Deirdre McCloskey talks about, that other economic historians talk about, is that the general state of the standard of living for most of human history was relatively flat. The conditions of life for someone in the France of Louis XVI was not so different from that of Charlemagne or that of someone in the Roman Empire, of the average citizen. And then in the 17th and 18th century, as the Enlightenment was taking place and as more rational ideas were being introduced into Western culture, and as the Industrial Revolution, the real fruit of rationality applied to the problem of survival, took off, we see this incredible leap, this almost disjunctive point in human history, when standards of living started to grow, and not just grow in a kind of secular way, but grow exponentially, to the point now that even in controlled economies around the world, because of the incredible productivity of the capitalist economies, the number of people living in poverty and living with suboptimal wages around the world has dropped in half. I mean, it's amazing just in the last 50 years how many people have been lifted out of poverty. And there's just oodles of empirical evidence showing this. But the real evidence of this, I think, is that the benevolence of people under a capitalist system, where their fellow citizens and their fellow man is not a threat to them. It's not someone who stands to use the power of government to take something from them in the form of taxes or regulations, is a system where people can recognize their common humanity, and where people become much more generous, right? That the market system facilitates, and did facilitate, before government stepped in and crowded out this kind of charity.
And this is best. Sorry to cut you off, Dr. Daniels. I'm back, by the way, after
Glad
some technical difficulties there. This is best exemplified, I think, in the idea of the double thank you. So you're at a grocery store. You make your purchase and you say thank you to the clerk, and the clerk says thank you to you. So this is a classic win-win, right? I want to pick your brain though, because we've been using the terms capitalism and laissez-faire capitalism, but for a lot of folks out there, they would associate what we live in today, in today's United States, or in Western Europe, they would call those capitalist societies. And I personally would use a different term for them to distinguish, but I'm curious to get your thoughts. Is there another term you would use for where we're living right now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And terminology on these issues is always a bit challenging, because on the grand scale, as we zoom out as wide as possible to compare political social systems, the political social systems of the Western democracies, of the developed nations of the world, including the Asian tigers, et cetera, is certainly more capitalist than other parts of the world. But as we zoom in and we think about capitalism in its ideal sense, right, which was the title of Ayn Rand's book. She wrote a book of essays entitled Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, specifically to kind of make reference to the point that a pure capitalist system is something that has been unrealized, right? Even in the least regulated periods of American history, there were nevertheless government interventions. And so what do we call this today? I mean, some economists, some political historians call it a mixed economy. Some call it a welfare state, because the large focus of government intervention is not the ownership of the means of production, but rather is about the redistribution of the productivity of a relatively private but nevertheless regulated market. It certainly is at best a regulated capitalism, or a welfare state capitalism, in most places. But I'm open to ideas about how to call it, because it's the terminological issue is a difficult one.
Term that I would use is crony capitalism.
Oh, crony,
right?
yeah, that's a good one as well.
That's what I had in mind, but I like all of your suggestions as well, because what we're describing here is the broad sense where people are free to transact with each other, to go to the grocery store and buy and sell from each other. But in our system, the more money you have, the more power you can buy, because the government regulates so much. So yeah, I've heard it called radical interventionism or the welfare state, crony capitalism.
Yeah, crony capitalism. Yeah, I like that. I like that primarily because of what you highlight there about the fact that in broad swaths of the economy, there is the feeling of open transactions and a kind of open bargaining on the marketplace. But behind that, and sometimes this is the insidious point about how this system works, behind that are a whole set of arrangements of how those markets are shaped and determined, that are shaped and determined by the kind of influence of people with access to the corridors of power. And there's been a blending, and this is exactly it. There's been a blending of the power that is accumulated, the economic power, the power to command resources through productive activity, when the national governments and the state governments around the world became more interventionist and started to regulate the conditions of labor and the profitability rates and the tax rates, et cetera, there was then an interest of those with economic power to have a seat at the table of making these regulations. And that's where the cronyism comes in, right? Today, the large companies in the United States, the Fortune 500 companies, one of the things that sometimes shocks some of my students when I explain this to them is that they give campaign contributions to political candidates. And everyone sort of says, oh, of course, corporations have political favorites and they want to see some people win elections and other people not win elections. But they actually give relatively equal amounts to candidates of opposite parties. They give equal amounts on both sides. And the reason is they're not just hedging their bets about who might win the election. What they're ultimately doing is they're paying for access. They're reminding people that they want to be part of that regulatory conversation. There's a great
It's almost
book.
like they don't care who wins so long as they have access.
Yeah, as long as, well, I mean, a good example might be there's a current Supreme Court case about social media and whether government overstepped its line in making recommendations to social media about who they should carry and what misinformation was, et cetera, et cetera.
The Missouri v. Biden.
The Missouri v. Murthy case, yeah.
Yeah.
And I was just teaching this case in my class, my constitutional law class, and I mentioned to the students that one of the most interesting aspects of this case is that if you look at the parties, there's an allegation that the government was using the social media companies as a kind of proxy to violate the First Amendment rights of various users that had access to these platforms. In all previous cases when this happened, when, for example, local government agents threatened book publishers about whether or not they were publishing books that were seen or deemed to be obscene or indecent, and when local sheriffs threatened credit card companies to not process payments from Backpage, for example, because there were supposedly illegal classified advertisements that were carried by Backpage. In all of those cases, the people who were being bullied by government, who were being told by government to do its bidding because government couldn't constitutionally reach those things, they brought suit. They said, hey, you're using us. You're basically making us into your tool, and you're violating the rights of these people on the other side. So far, at least as far as I know, the social media companies have not entered the fray in this. It's been two state attorneys general and private citizens who've said, hey, the government has used these social media companies as a proxy. And we could see this both ways, that maybe they're saying like they don't want to enter the fray because they might get more regulation on their business, or they don't want to enter the fray because they don't want to antagonize a user base. But there's also the sense that they want to stay out of this because their expectation is that there will be new regulations that come out of the other side of this. And they want to be open to the possibility that they can play both sides. And that's the cronyism that you're talking about, where it's
Absolutely.
not a capitalist system where they say, here's our product, here's how we're going to run it, take it or leave it. Either be our customer or don't. And we're not going to listen to government. We're not going to listen to anyone else. We're going to run our business according to our best judgment. Instead, we see them being called to testify in Congress, and we see that there's extensive communication between staffs of government and these businesses. That's not a free market. That's not capitalism. That's a system where people are trying to shape the market and set the rules. I mean, the Federal Register in the United States is
shape the rules to their own benefit, right?
Yeah. There's 70,000 pages of federal rules about how we do business in this country.
And by the way, for our audience out there, you're on the Students for Liberty YouTube channel. That's probably where you're watching this. If you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see a video called Ethan Yang, Uncovering Truth and Fighting for Freedom. And this is all about one of Students for Liberty's best and brightest students, Ethan Yang, who filed a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, and actually has been very influential in this Missouri v. Biden social media case that Dr. Daniels has been talking about. So if you're interested in that after this live stream is over, check out Ethan Yang, Uncovering Truth and Fighting for Freedom. And Ethan is an awesome example of one of Students for Liberty's best and brightest students. And if you're inspired by what he's done and all that he's been able to accomplish, consider checking out Students for Liberty and the Prometheus Fellowship program, which is for the best of the best Students for Liberty. That's where I got my favorite mug last year at the conference in Miami. And leading up to our big event, LibertyCon, this year it's in DC, will be the Prometheus Fellowship program, week-long sessions, trainings, networking opportunity. Again, that's for the best and the brightest at Students for Liberty.
And just to add a plug for that, I mean, when I spoke at the event last year, I would say I walked away from that. I knew I was going to meet 50 people from around the world. I was both impressed by the geographic extent of the Prometheus Fellows, the fact that the Liberty movement it's not just Western Europe and the United States and some other handful of countries. This is all through the continent of Africa. This is all through East Asia. This is really an around the world movement. And not only that, I was also equally impressed by the fact that every single one of the individuals that I had an opportunity to talk with was deeply involved in making real change in their countries. So, we're talking a lot about the United States today. We're talking about, it's my frame of reference, but I was amazed by the level of, I see I've got my reactions on. I was amazed by the level of dedication of some of these individuals, as well as just the power of what they're doing in their countries. The real impact that they're having.
And if you're out there, if you're out there listening, we've got folks from Turkey chiming in the comments. If you're out there, you want to make a real difference in your country, in your community, consider Students for Liberty. Consider applying for the Prometheus Fellowship program. Consider joining us at LibertyCon in Washington, D.C., February 2nd through the 4th. And as you see at the bottom there, you can use the code Prometheus to save 10% off your registration. Again, just to reset, I'm Trevor Krause, story editor and scriptwriter for the Learn Liberty YouTube channel. I'm talking with Dr. Eric Daniels about the morality of free markets. And Dr. Daniels, what existed before capitalism? We've heard, in our history textbooks, right? We might have learned feudalism, these kind of what seem like antiquated notions of social contract, social interactions. So what was there before capitalism? And do you think there might be something after capitalism that
Yeah.
the human
Yeah.
race is heading toward?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question because the historical narrative leading up to, as I said earlier, to the, say, 17th and 18th century, when we first start to see a robust set of institutions oriented around the kinds of productivity and trade that we associate with capitalism, and simultaneously the political revolutions that are happening in the United States and in Western Europe and in other places around the globe that support that, right? That there's a kind of double coincidence of change that happens in these eras. It's not just, well, actually more than maybe a triple. It's not just the industrial revolution. It's also the political revolutions as well as the productive revolution, right? That takes place, that sets up the industrial revolution, these economic changes. But it's wedded to a set of political changes. Prior to the advent of what we would call something approaching the capitalist system, first in fits and starts in Great Britain, in the United States, in Germany, France, and other parts of Europe, what essentially existed, going all the way back in the West to the fall of the Roman Empire, was what you said, this feudalist system. But even through Rome and back into Greece and back into the earliest times of recorded history, the biggest difference, I think, in the kind of political system that existed, because the economic system was more iterative in its evolution. Right? The Romans had private property. They had a robust contract law, which is the basis of much of the law of the capitalist countries today. I mean, many of those ideas existed all the way back to Rome, Greece, and even before that. But what the political system had that was very different was it didn't have a fundamental respect for the rights and autonomy of the individual. Many of the political systems of Western Europe assumed a kind of paternalism, that the ruler, the monarch, the sovereign, was almost like the father of a family. And there were sets of mutually reinforcing obligations that in the feudal system, these were codified, that from serfs all the way up to landlords, to knights and lords and kings. But even informally, most of these systems had an assumption that your life was not your own. And what happened in the 18th century after the Enlightenment and the recognition of the individual as the repository of moral value, right? That morality was an individual question. That changed the political perspective, and it reset that. Thinkers like Locke and Grotius and Pufendorf thinking about these ideas and explaining that in order to resolve back to questions of how do individuals live morally in society was not about meeting their obligations to their social betters and to their social inferiors, but rather setting terms for themselves that could equally apply across the board, that there was a fundamental individualism about it. And out of that grew those political revolutions that started to reinforce the idea of individual rights as the proper basis of government.
So that's how we got to where we are now.
Yeah.
But for example, if you talk to a hardened socialist, they might point to that transition and say, well, we went from feudalism to capitalism or
bourgeois
something.
Capitalism. Yeah.
Right. And it's almost like they foresee a future, maybe it's in 100 years or 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 years, where human nature will have so fundamentally changed that we'll have this new socialist man, right, who puts others' interests above or on a same playing field as his own. And of course, Ayn Rand would disagree with that. She'd probably say that's not going to happen, and it's not a good thing if it does.
If it did.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Marx describes not only in the Capitalist Manifesto and in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, but he has this notion that the inherent development of human society from what he calls slave societies to feudal societies to petty capitalists to bourgeois capitalists, ultimately he says to socialist and then to communist, right? That for Marx there is this teleological development from what was before the institution, really kind of before the institution of the state. There was a primitive communism, he says, and that's when everyone was working for the common good and was taking from the common. It was almost a kind of organic notion of human community where everyone essentially effaced their own individuality and their own perspective and worked for the group, and that the group got to dictate to the individual what his or her role was. And then what happened was, as Marx says, the initiation of all of this bad in the world was from the initiation of private property, from me saying, this is mine and not yours. Primitive, that original appropriation, Marx says, is what caused all of the problems and developed all of the institutions of exploitation, he says. And so out of capitalism, what's really interesting about Marx is that many people assume, Marx says, oh, capitalism is going to fail and it's going to have crises and depressions and all these other things. Marx actually thinks that that's going to come about because of this raised consciousness of the proletariat. He has enormous praise for capitalism as a productive system. He just doesn't like the way the distribution is taking place. So for Marx, that ultimate society that he envisions is one where you somehow capture the incredible, and he says, communist society will put to shame how productive capitalism is. We're just going to have, everybody can have everything, basically. It's almost like a Roddenberry idea of Star Trek where people stop working for money, they just work for pleasure, and you have warp drives and replicators, and you just have all this magical technology. Where is that going to come from? Who's going to have the authority to decide how to use it? He leaves that sort of open. I think when we think about where we're going from here, there really is not an evolutionary choice in the way that Marx is talking about somehow changing human nature, right? One of the things that he relies upon is that human beings stop associating their choices and values with their own selves, and they start thinking about the collective and somehow actually changing human nature, right? And it's an interesting idea. It's been proposed by a lot of utopian philosophies over the centuries, but when it comes down to it, it seems that human nature has a lot of fixity and constancy about it. That what we read about in ancient texts, those people sound, although they're different, they sound a lot like what we are today. Marx's notion that people have this changed consciousness just hasn't come to pass. But if we think about where we're going, it's really a choice of, do we continue to go down the line of reverting back to the systems where the individual doesn't have priority, where rights are grants from the state, not something that is a protection against the state, where the group can dictate to the individual and deprive the individual of his or her choices and values and pursuits? Or do we want to move back in the direction where we can remove the elements that have corrupted a more pure capitalism and work more toward the idea of freedom and autonomy for individuals in a system that protects individual rights? So it's essentially, do we go toward more capitalism, or do we continue to wear away those institutions of capitalism and sort of, in a way, put out the light of this? As I said, you look at that history and that hockey stick where more human beings are flourishing today than ever before. Do you want to snuff out the thing that drove that progress and watch that either level off or start to decline, or do we want to be able to bring that to more people? And the only way to do that is to continue to fight everywhere, really, for those institutions of capitalism and the protection of individual rights across the board, right? What we were talking about earlier, it's not just about property rights and the economic questions. It's about people's rights of conscience and people's rights to free speech and people's rights to, to personal autonomy. Those are all, one of the things that Rand observed is that rights are a unity, right? You can't have so-called civil rights or political rights without economic rights. You can't have economic rights without political rights. It's a point made across the liberty movement. Friedman made this point, others recognize it, but it's vitally important to recognize that.
And I think that's a key argument that we face from our friends or friends, colleagues, associates, whatever, on the left, is that there is this distinction between economic rights and other kinds of rights. And of course, we know that, as you said very well, that doesn't jive. That doesn't make sense. And in fact, Ayn Rand's favorite symbol, right, was the dollar sign, because it is our use of money in transacting with each other that it's through the use of money that we exhibit our respect for our fellow human, right? She said, it's either money or guns and chains and whips in the famous money speech of Atlas Shrugged. Why, though, did Ayn Rand sort of stops short of full-on anarcho-capitalism or full-on anarchy. I was reading something that she wrote last night. It's called an essay called "The Nature of Government" in her book, "The Virtue of Selfishness." And she saw some role for the government in protecting people from criminals and in national defense. So why do you think she saw so many great benefits of almost entirely unregulated capitalism, but stopped just short of full-on anarcho-capitalism, a la David Friedman, for example?
Right. Yeah. No, it's a great question, and it's one that's been part of the liberty movement since the 1960s, when Ayn Rand was first writing. Really, maybe since the 1950s, when Murray Rothbard was going to Ayn Rand's apartment to have discussions about these ideas. It's really been at the core of a lot of these discussions about what is the proper role of government. And for Ayn Rand's perspective, the question ultimately comes down to the need for an objective, neutral arbiter of the kinds of questions when force arises. That is half of the equation, right? So when you say if you completely go all the way down to privatized security forces, et cetera, there's an assumption that there's some kind of arbitrage between them, that they could resolve disputes. But what if that dispute is not resolvable, right? What if the police of Colorado and the police of Wyoming fundamentally have a disagreement? There needs to be a higher neutral arbiter. Now, the argument is often, well, ultimately you still have to trust government. There's got to be some government that makes this determination, and can't it become abusive of that power? Even the final arbiter, the neutral arbiter. Well, of course, that is always possible. Human nature is such that people can abuse power. And that's why written constitutions and the vigilance of the people is so important. But the other aspect, which I think might even be more important, and which is often not as central to this debate as the question about, well, what happens if the two police forces or the jailer in the one state doesn't like the rules of the judge in the other state, et cetera. That question is, there in fact exists among rational men who do not wield force against each other, who are nevertheless working in cooperation via voluntary trade. There are nevertheless real disputes where each individual believes that he might be in the right. And there needs to be a government system to help arbitrate those disputes, the court system. So in complex business contracts, it's entirely possible that with the best of intentions, without using the idea of initiating force against another, that rational human beings have different estimations of a complex set of facts, whether it's over who has the rightful claim over a particular resource, or whether it's, did someone fulfill the contract that we had based on the terms that we set out. These things do arise, and they would arise among rational societies. And there is a need in those societies for that to be arbitrated in a way that cannot be simply, you say, oh, well, what about private arbitration associations? Yeah, that's always fine. And people can mutually agree to that. But there's always the question of when someone walks away from that dissatisfied. There's always the possibility that people say, we need to have some completely neutral arbiter. It's not my arbitration firm or your arbitration firm. We need a government judge, someone who has the power ultimately to coerce the person who is in the wrong to remedy that wrong for the person who is in the right. And that is something that doesn't need criminals, doesn't need foreign invaders to have that conversation. That's maybe sometimes why it falls into the background. But it's a real need of a rational society that's going to develop the kind of complex institutions and economic arrangements that we would have under a laissez-faire economy.
Because it's well established that two witnesses, for example, at a jury trial can have seen the exact same thing, exact same crime take place, for example, and have totally different interpretations, or they remember different facial features about the alleged criminal, and so they would describe to the sketch artist, right, some totally different face,
totally different thing. It was a red car. No, it was a blue car. So
do you think we could call that a market failure? Like in some sense, the market can't provide an objective answer to these kinds of questions, even if two people were to agree to a private arbitration?
Yeah, that's an interesting spin, I think, that you've put on the question of a market failure. Market failure, of course, typically is analyzed in the way where, I mean, the most common case of, I'd say the most two common cases, that usually come up are in market failure discussions are public goods cases where there's a problem of isolating the property rights in a particular good, the so-called spoilage of the commons, and then also kind of externalities where certain economic productivity implies a harm on non-contracting third parties, and how do you account for that? What you've done, I think you've put a kind of interesting spin on it and said that, well, if we assume a non-governmental society, a kind of pure anarchist society where there are contracting agencies, the public good there that is subject to a market failure, if we're assuming that there's just a market, I guess in a way becomes justice, right? That the good that the society needs is for there to be a standard of what is just. What is a just arrangement when two parties who have these different impressions about the same facts, whether that's a witness testimony, as you point out, which is a very common example, or whether that's an interpretation of a 200-page contract, right? My lawyer says it says this, and your lawyer says it says that, and you owe me $100 million, and you tell me I owe you $100 million. Like, how do we know who's right? And if all we have is that contracting party, the result may nevertheless happen, and we may not, run out and violate each other's rights by initiating force. The arbitrator may make a decision, but we don't have in that situation. Let's say, you're working behind the scenes to leverage your influence on the arbitrator or whatever. We don't have justice, and so justice is the thing that we're not paying for, and that needs to be something that is established by that neutral arbiter. I mean, it's an interesting analysis. I have never really thought of it that way, but I think what you're suggesting is that if we think that there's only markets and there's no ultimate, neutrality of saying, here are the rules, here's what justice looks like, and we have people who are professionals who are paid to administer these systems, not only in the criminal, in the criminal context, justice is an important thing as well, but also in the business dispute context. And if that is absent, then that's the real thing that's being lost by not being contracted for. And ultimately, that's something that Rand says has to be resolved into this idea of government, that there has to be a way of saying the responsive force, when people initiate force, right? When I don't give you the $100 million I owe you, I'm holding it from you in the same way as if I took it from your pocket. There needs to be someone who can tell me justice is that you need to surrender that $100 million to Trevor, because that is what the ruls say.
That's exactly what it says, Dr. Daniels. Yes,
well, as soon as I get that first $100 million, it's yours. You can't hold me to that. If I win the lotto, that's not a contract.
We're coming up on about 10 minutes left, and
Sure.
This has been Dr. Daniels. Thank you so much for
absolutely.
For chatting with us. He will be, by the way, in Washington, D.C. The last week of January leading up to LibertyCon. He'll be there with the Prometheus Fellowship program. If you're interested in these ideas, I couldn't recommend it more highly. This program through the Prometheus Foundation puts together some of the best and brightest minds in the liberty movement, at least among young folks, and trains them in objectivist thinking, but also networking, writing, public speaking, all kinds of important skills. So if you're interested in that, if you're interested in objectivist ideas, check out the Prometheus Fellowship program, and check Students for Liberty out at LibertyCon, which, as you see, is February 2nd through 4th. Go to libertycon.com and you can use the code Prometheus, who allegedly stole fire from the gods, right, and brought it to man. That's why he's the icon for Ayn Rand and many objectivists. Use the code Prometheus to save 10% off your registration. Like I said, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if you have any burning questions out there, we've got this great global audience. If you have any burning questions for Dr. Daniels, put it in the chat. We'll try to cover it.
And while people might be putting it in the chat, just one more plug. I did it's a 5 or 6 part video series for Students for Liberty, and part of the Learn Liberty video series. I know that's available if you sign up through Students for Liberty website, specifically talking through more of these issues. So a series, I think it's 5, maybe 6. I don't remember how many we recorded, but a course on deeper investigation, not just of Ayn Rand on capitalism, but more about her ideas throughout her philosophy, that you can get on the Students for Liberty Learn Liberty platform. So a big plug for that as well. I had a great time doing it, and it was a lot of fun to be able to create that series so that people could dive deeper into these ideas.
One thing I wanted to get your thoughts on is, if you know, why did Ayn Rand want to call her philosophy existentialism? But she said she was beaten to the punch, right, by Jean-Paul
By
Sartre
Sartre and Camus and others.
Camus, right? So she was beaten to
Yeah.
the punch of the term existentialism, and so she had to settle, I guess, for second best, objectivism. What's
Right.
the background there?
Yeah, so in Ayn Rand's philosophy, there is one of the most foundational ideas to answer a lot of the sort of higher level questions that come up in philosophy in the fields of epistemology. How do we know what we know? What is the nature of truth, etc. And then in ethics, what is the good? How does one derive values? Is there a connection between the conditions of existence and the virtues that one should pursue? And then all the way into politics, what is the nature of justice, etc. And the issue that she has at the very basis of her philosophy is an orientation at a metaphysical level that says that existence is primary, and this primary of existence principle or perspective really is what informs so many of the other ways that she approaches philosophic questions, that there is a certain logic, I think, to suggest that the radical focus on the primacy of objectivism or of existence is a kind of key to understanding a lot of her philosophy. And what this means is the contrast, right? So what does it mean to say the primacy of existence? Ultimately, what this is, and it ties into the objectivism idea, is that our consciousness doesn't control reality, right? That whether it's the idea of a supernatural consciousness that can dictate the terms of how we live in our lives, or whether it's a kind of subjectivism of 50 million Frenchmen can't be wrong. Well, they can't just wish things into existence, or that your subjective truth, your consciousness doesn't actually change the facts, right? That the facts are what they are. And this is why in her novel Atlas Shrugged, she relies upon her restatement of the three basic axioms of Aristotelian logic. A is A, the if or the either or, and existence exists. The idea that the primacy of reality, and that our function in dealing with reality is to look to the facts and be guided by the facts, not our emotions, not our wishes, our wants, our desires. That existence is primary, and that answers a lot of questions, not in just how we think, but how we live and how we order our political arrangement. And as you said, of course, these earlier European philosophers had already taken hold of the idea of existentialism. And so objectivity, though, is a central concept in her epistemology. And it derives from the fact that to think properly, to think rationally, and to live rationally, to pursue values rationally, one has to be guided by the principle of objectivity, which means almost an unbreached adherence to the idea that you will follow the facts, that you will follow the reality. And so objectivity means, a proper methodology for applying your consciousness, your thinking, to the questions of the problems of existence. And so reminding ourselves of that role for objectivity through the name Objectivism, I think is probably a good second best. But yeah, it would be interesting, a world in which they hadn't come up with that, and her philosophy was called existentialism. Because the one trick about it, I think, in contemporary parlance is that intrinsic, objective, subjective, these terms have other uses. And so people who have never heard of Ayn Rand talk about a thing that they call objectivism in contrast to subjectivism. And so it sometimes makes that distinction a little bit less clear. But when you specify that it's the philosophy that she articulated, then at least it clears that issue up.
This is a good comment that we got. What are your thoughts on this? Robert Sharbit says in the chat, I don't agree with Ayn Rand that selfishness opposes altruism. He says it's a condition for altruism, and that the only way to get rich in a capitalist country is to create value for someone else. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And again, we come to one of these issues about what are often the the colloquial meanings of terms and what are things that Ayn Rand wanted to withhold as a kind of philosophic definition of terms. What she meant, just to be clear, so that everyone who may not be as familiar, I think Robert must be somewhat familiar, at least with her work from his question. What she meant by selfishness was rational self-interest, not the kind of Nietzschean, do what you want, it doesn't matter what the consequences are for other people. She said that your self-interest is not a thing that you determine on your own. It's something that is guided by your proper interaction with reality. That you can't just say, you know, my self-interest is to eat pizza all day. I mean, that's going to have health consequences. My self-interest is to live without eating. That's going to have health consequences. You know, there are things that are objectively true about the human condition that make some things clearly not in your self-interest. There's a lot of room for optional values, right? So you have to eat something. You have to eat something nutritious. Well, there's a whole range of things. But there is a dividing line between what is healthy and what is not. And your self-interest is to pursue those things that in your context and in the facts about your life are going to lead you to those ends. Altruism is similar in that people sometimes think altruism just means benevolence. Altruism, as it was derived by Auguste Comte in the 19th century, the term otherism is what it comes from. For alter, from the Latin, otherism. In the rigorous context, although not always in the colloquial context, sometimes altruism in a colloquial context just means being charitable or being benevolent. The real meaning of the term philosophically is to place the interests of others above your own. So literally to deny yourself in order to serve or to meet the needs and values of others, which means that it requires sacrifice. It requires a production of values against one's own interest in order to serve others. So it's like, it's, you know, me trading with others and, as Robert says, creating value in the marketplace. I'm not going to get rich if I create something that nobody wants, right? There is the reality that an economic process involves the minds and the judgments of others, right? I may have the best product ever, but if no one recognizes its value yet, or if no one can implement it yet, it's not going to make me a lot of money. So I do need to adapt my choices. If my goal is to attain a large fortune, I will need to adapt my choices to things that can be objectively recognized by others, because the only other choice would be to force them to buy my products. If I can't convince them of them and persuade them of it. So just creating value for others isn't altruistic because I gain value. It's what we were talking about earlier, the mutual gains from trade, the double thank you, right? But if I orient my business around simply liquidating resources in order to serve others against my own interests, denying my family money, denying myself nutrition, denying myself these values, truly sacrificing, giving up values for the sake of someone else's values, that's not trade anymore, and that's not benevolence anymore. That's punishing me in order to serve others. So it depends a little bit in my answer, my perspective on his question. I agree with him that you have to create the value in order to do well in society, and that it has to be objectively recognized by other people. But I don't think that that's a sacrifice to me, because typically the people who create enormous values not only enjoy the process, but that is the means that they use to sustain themselves. So yeah, you can't build a fortune without other people, but you don't serve those other people in denial of yourself. You do it in a way that actually is mutually beneficial, and they only buy your product if they themselves recognize that it's a value for them. You can't do it any other way. I mean, absent, compelling them to do it.
And perhaps we could say that the topic of our conversation today has been the morality of free markets, the morality of capitalism. Perhaps we could say that capitalism and free markets are moral in part because they incentivize the capitalist, the business person, to consider, at the very least, the interests and the desires and the needs of other people. Right?
Yeah,
if you're going to put up.
And there's a great record of that. There's a book by Virgil Storr, who's a professor at George Mason University, that I think the title is just "Are Markets Moral?" or something like that. And he and I think Emily Chamley, and I'm trying to remember his co-authors, but certainly Virgil is the lead author on that book. And they've done enormously interesting empirical work to suggest that when you talk about those kinds of values, they are encouraged and flourish in systems that are more open and free in their economic arrangements than ones that aren't. So yeah, it as you say, it definitely encourages those things.
And that leads us to this very last question. We've only got like 20 seconds. Can you put
Sure, yeah, I'll try to give the quick answer.
Did Rand's experience of Soviet collectivism, do you think, influence the development of her love for capitalism?
I think it did. I mean, I think, yeah, to answer Russell's question in the 20-second bit that we've got right now, Ayn Rand, she lived through the Russian Revolution, she lived through the Bolshevik Revolution, and I think it would be remiss to say that she didn't have any perspective on that. In fact, it was something that opened her eyes to the reality of Soviet communism in a way that it took people in America another 50, 60 years before they acknowledged the reality of the death and destruction that's wrought by that kind of collectivization. She, of course, had to learn herself what was the alternative, but the negative reference value was very clear to her from that experience.
Well, Dr. Daniels, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks,
And
Trevor.
again,
I appreciate everybody who came.
If you're out there, if you're inspired by these ideas, check out Students for Liberty and one of our keystone programs, the Prometheus Fellowship program, which will school you in objectivist ethics, but also networking, reading, writing, all kinds of skills that you need to be the next generation of leaders for liberty. So visit studentsforliberty.org and consider joining us at LibertyCon in Washington, D.C., February 2nd through 4th. Dr. Eric Daniels has been my guest today. Thank you, Dr. Daniels, so much for joining us. It was a fascinating discussion on the morality of free markets. And if you get a chance to join us in Washington, D.C. at the end of January, Dr. Daniels will be there as part of the Prometheus Fellowship program. Yeah. Thank you to everybody from our global audience, and thank you, Dr. Daniels.
Yep. Bye, everybody.